Welcome to the Numerical Tarot. A new tarot paradigm. An alternative to tradition. An axial system of archetypal crystallography. A transculturally anthropomorphized, life-biased binary influence calculator. A wisdom system and archetype enhancer, with harmony of interpretation throughout. The content of all the videos in this series are excerpts, edits and brief summaries from the eBooks All Things Are Numbers and All Things Are Patterns, links below. For a more complete explanation of each idea, additional reading might be helpful. Hopefully the basic ideas come across enough to pique your interest in trying this alternative approach to tarot. One of the most important ideas to remember so far is the idea of a universe on a Mobius strip or Mobius sphere. When combined with the concentric stages of homing and ideas like transcendence, we show how our finite universe is not only limited, but self-contained, a recursive, fractal system from which there is no escape. Another important concept to remember is the sliding scale of relative definition as seen in the successive stages of coagulation. Moving from paradox to the finite mass of the model shows how we are all in fact born from the chaos of nothingness as well as limited by nothingness. In other words, when our contemplative minds venture out of our finite world, we find that we actually melt back into the very nothingness that contains us, as relative levels of comprehensibility become increasingly chaotic, complex, or increasingly incomprehensible. Because we are in fact contained by relative levels of comprehensibility, or incomprehensibility, we might well conclude that in fact any and all attempts to enter the realm of the infinite with a finite mind will cause all tools of finite perception to dissolve, thus effectively creating a condition of diminishing returns within the stages of concentric containment that surround any entity event. Likewise, if we explore this condition of diminishing returns and pursue it to its logical extreme, we find that we eventually encounter the effects of our split absentia and the Mobius twist of paradoxical enclosure, where our minds and logic completely fail. By joining 2 points of absentia together with a twist, the resulting Mobius effect creates a yin-yang unity between the two halves of this impossible pair, with the universe as their impetus of connecting flux. At the same time, the absentia remains a binding force between any two sides of that very same universe, as all sides converge upon the inner absentia, creating a yin-yang unity of their own. In the design of our model, we see the 2 points of absentia as reciprocal in nature, due to their identical need to be excluded from any universe, and the point-to-sphere fashion the model uses to maintain this condition. Because of this unique relationship, we can conclude that the essential sameness of a point and a sphere comes from the identicalness of these 2 points of absentia, while at the same time, we can see that the essential difference of the 2 points of absentia comes from the differences between a point and a sphere. The outer absentia is seen as a yielding absence, from which the universe emerges and cannot return until all possibilities of development have occurred. While conversely, the inner absentia becomes the impossible state of squelched exclusion from that universe by becoming an excluded middle between converging opposites. In observing this absentia to absentia path, we find yet another example of cosmic reciprocity, i.e., exclusion yields totality, universe from outer absentia, while totality is reduced to exclusion, singularity of inner absentia. Together, these 2 points of absentia represent the two sides of one-sidedness. Only through the impossible state of being neither, outer absentia, sphere, are we able to become all, in between universe. While at the same time, the equally impossible state of being all, conflicts in a two-sided universe, only makes us neither, inner absentia, point. The absentia is a theoretical container of infinity. By having a concept like paradox as a container to infinity, we can see how, for us and our finite minds, the problem with infinity will be in our attempts to make it finite, while the problem with the absentia will be in trying to make it not be a paradox, and dealing with the unresolvable contradictions it creates. As our finite minds move beyond our finite reality and into infinity, our finite tools of perception begin to fail us, creating the condition of diminishing returns with respect to our ability to maintain comprehensibility amid complexity. While on the other hand, we find that attempts to resolve the paradox of the absentia seem to take us a step beyond futility. In other words, by moving in on the absentia, we actually begin to chase our own tail, as we are ultimately led around and around, through the two sides of our one-sided Mobius-shaped universe, or the one side of our two-sided Mobius-shaped universe. The difference, then, between problems of the absentia and problems of infinity, comes from the necessary exclusion of the absentia from the universe that is attempting to perceive its form. In other words, infinity is a concept our finite minds will never understand, but the absentia is no concept at all. Thus, by definition, it becomes totally unobtainable as an element of discussion. In other words, the absentia does its best work by being absent. Hence the name. Absent, So that means that to even bring it up as a topic of discussion is a pointless act of futility because that only makes it not absent, and to make the absentia not absent is to dilute its true essence. Or, to put it another way, the absentia that can be spoken is not the true absentia. This concept of diminishing returns is very important. As an additional aid in the visualization of diminishing returns, we can use a creative analogy involving an imaginary bed sheet, stretched tight, across a mattress of infinity, the fabric of spacetime. In the bed sheet analogy, we find that if we pinch a sheet somewhere and twist it, wrinkles will radiate out from our fingers. If our eye follows one of those wrinkles, the wrinkle will eventually fade away and blend back into the flatness of the sheet. Because the wrinkled parts and the flat parts are made of the same stuff, we can conclude that the wrinkles become visible, taking on a definable appearance, only because the twist of our fingers has caused them to be different than the rest of the sheet. Determining where this difference begins and ends is the job of our model, the number line, and the conditions of diminishing returns that they attempt to describe. The bedsheet analogy is a good metaphor because it shows how the model and the non-model literally coexist. It shows how one is just a twisted, coalesced version of the other. The bedsheet analogy is roughly equatable to the warping of spacetime around a mass of existence. Warping, twisting, whatever. But the real fun begins when we contemplate what happens beyond the infinite bedsheet and between the fingers that hold the twist together. This is where we find the elements of the single absentia split into its two locations, pulling the two-sided figure of our universe into a one-sided Mobius-like form. This is of course another two-dimensional analogy attempting to describe a condition that, technically speaking, is beyond the ability of any human to accurately visualize or diagram. In the model, diminishing returns is what keeps the finite and infinite apart in our binary universe. In other words, in this universe we not only can't take it with us, the finite into the infinite, we also cannot bring it, the infinite, back into the finite world. Together our coagulating, homing and converging analogies show us how all attempts to bring the infinite into the finite world, without causing it to coagulate, or wrinkle like a bedsheet, into a finite form no longer representative of its true nature, is about as possible as bottling an emotion. The model we are constructing is designed to describe existence. It emerges from non-existence. But, as the bedsheet analogy shows us, existence is just non-existence, with a twist, to make it visible, or manifest, to the senses of other manifest entities. Thus, on a grander scale we see how existence and non-existence, or something and nothing, are all one thing. As we apply the concept of diminishing returns to our minds, we see how it effectively describes the dichotomy between conscious and unconscious thoughts in a brain, which we now also see as one thing. The bedsheet analogy shows how conscious and unconscious coexist. Diminishing returns describes the effects of a universe containing infinity and definition as opposing elements, with a sliding scale of relative order and chaos between them. But order and chaos are only one way of describing the landscape between these extremes. Another analogy could be the electromagnetic spectrum. In this analogy we surmise that the thoughts in our mind are the result of vibrations. Thus we could say that short, fast waves are equivalent to a point and represent the conscious mind, while long, slow waves are equivalent to a sphere and represent the unconscious mind. The absentia is where the slowest vibrations become no vibration and where the fastest vibrations become no vibration. Everything in between these absentia bookends is life, consciousness, and existence. Thus, because the absentia is no concept at all, not possible, unobtainable, and absent from any universe, it cannot be identified as an element of that universe. Because of this, a study of paradox becomes the only way of identifying or describing its Mobius-like form. In other words, for us, paradox is the paint we pour over the absentia to see where it is. When we find paradox, we've found God. So let's go hunting. Some people use the word paradox to define any kind of conundrum or irony involving any kind of apparent conflict between premises or conclusions. Some use the word paradox to define anything that is beyond comprehension, like the concept of infinity. Some use the word paradox to define any kind of sophistry, false statement, or lie. Personally, I take a narrower view in my definition of paradox. In addition to confining my definition of paradox to the limits of the elements that eventually face off in conflict, I also limit my idea of paradox in other ways. To me, I think that to have paradox, we need to have sides facing off, even if it is just a self-referential face-off. To be a true paradox, the face-off has to be a truly unresolvable conflict. Most definitions I've read of paradox employ the words contrary or contradiction in them. But, to my mind, it has to be more than just conflict or contradiction. It has to be an interdependent relationship between possibilities that produce mutually, alternately, or inclusively unacceptable, unmanageable, and unresolvable impossibilities. It has to be a contradiction where the relative truth value of one side supports the relative truth value of another side, whose function it is to oppose the relative truth value of the first side, thereby negating the relative truth value of the first side, which then negates the relative truth value of the second side, which of course restores the relative truth value of the first side, which then restores the relative truth value of the second side, which again negates the relative truth value of the first side, etc., ad nauseum. Thus, to me, it is not paradox until this uniquely interdependent, unresolvable looping effect is evident. Or something equally interdependent in unresolvable impossibility, with the appearance of possibility intact. Paradox is possible impossibilities with impossible possibilities. How do we get the looping effect? In the case of the absentia, its function is to represent impossibility. That's one half of the two things we need to create a paradox. A universe is the other. The universe represents all that is possible. But mixing impossible and possible alone doesn't create paradox. The missing ingredient is a cosmic twist to make our conflicting and contradicting opposites relate to each other in a way comparable to that of the relationship seen in a Mobius strip, where a two-sided piece of paper is made to have only one side. Without the twist, a band of paper is still two-sided, representing any type of non-paradoxical opposition or conflict that we might encounter in our binary universe, where we eventually decide between ambiguous choices or lessers of two evils. That's normal. But, with a twist, a band of paper can be shown to have two sides, or one side that is two-sided, or two sides that are one-sided. Is it one-sided? Yes. Is it two-sided? Yes. If you think it is two-sided, I'll show you how it is one-sided. If you think it is one-sided, I'll show you how it is two-sided. This is the nature of a true paradox. From the Mobius band example, we can see how the real trick to paradox, and in my mind the real definition of paradox, is how each binary conclusion is entirely dependent upon the other, and how one conclusion can't happen without the interdependent influence of the incompatible opposite whose function it is to make the other side to not happen. Paradox is a symbiotic relationship between sides that makes each one be and not be at the same time. This is paradox. In our tarot universe, the absentia, and the Mobius effect it creates, become the bottom line form for all paradoxes, antinomies, oxymorons, and conundrums. The spherical Mobius idea, and the chicken and egg qualities of its beginnings, create varying types of paradoxes within the opposing sides of our binary universe. Left alone, these paradoxes create frustration in a world of finite beings attempting absolute definition of their world. To me, the unresolvable contradictions of paradox become simple manifestations of logic upon a Mobius band, or in our case, sphere. By theorizing that a Mobius effect is universal, logic becomes but one possible coat of paint to pour over this unspeakable form. How the elements of common language and logical thought manage to find their way into expressing this universal trap of infinite, recursive, fractal regress is another question I leave open for speculation. When I set out to study paradoxes of logic, the first thing I noticed about them was that they didn't all use the same exact trick to achieve the endless looping effect so common to them all. Because the source of the looping effect was so obvious to me, whether it is correct or not, I began to focus my attention on the subtle differences in how this loop was formed in each example I found. In examining the looping effect of paradox, I found that even though some paradoxes involved more, or sometimes fewer, than two elements to their form, they seemed, inevitably, to all arrive at the same place somewhere down the line. To me, this place always appeared as some kind of inevitable conflict between opposites. In other words, regardless of how many elements were used to create the paradox in question, paradox would not occur until the logic involved took up sides, as it were. Upon closer examination, it became apparent that these sides did not always confront each other in the same way. Some would seem to overlap in conflict, i.e., two things trying to be in one place at the same time. While other times the conflict seemed to resemble a more disparate dilemma, i.e., one thing trying to be in two places at once. As I continued to ponder the idea of opposites that are either overlapping or in diametrical conflict, a pattern of my own came to mind. The apart-together model. As I contemplated the idea of placing paradox examples on this spectrum as an organizational device, I began to toy with the idea of looking for other examples that could fit appropriately into the remaining stages of this model. I was successful, but I am not going to include the results of that study here, because it would make this video too long. You'll have to buy my book. In creating a device for examining paradox, the apart-together model revealed a possible culprit to the conflict found within the examples of paradox I encountered. Within the confines of this spectrum's influence, one could easily conclude that it is in fact the impossibility of squelching the inner absentia, combined with the equally impossible task of containing an outer absentia, that offers the resistance to absolute acceptance within all paradoxes, inasmuch as all paradoxes insist upon absolute acceptance of one solution over another, which they do. If this condition of absolute acceptance is true, it is not difficult to reason that, within the limits of this spectrum, all possible attempts to be absolute will produce a paradox of absolute impossibility. Thus, within the grand design of our homemade universe, we find that the only way to be absolute is to be impossible, thereby making it impossible to be absolute. Or to put it another way, to know there is no absolute truth is to know the absolute truth. This, as I see it, becomes the ruling logic of paradox, as well as the ruling paradox of logic. Of course, to some, this may not be acceptable. To the finite minds of the world who cannot allow the undefinable to remain undefined, paradoxes are an endless source of challenge. In some cases, these people attempt to blame the condition of paradox on the two-sided nature of the logic employed. They attempt to resolve paradoxes with alternate methods of reason, such as abandoning the notion of sides. But for me, the notion of a sideless universe does not eliminate paradox. Because, the way I see it, a sideless world is not compatible with a sided world. Thus, to alter our mind to be sideless only makes the sided world we leave behind as paradoxical to our sideless mind as a sideless world was to our sided mind. By being incompatible, we are forced to adopt one mindset or another. In being forced to adopt one mindset or another, we find that paradox does not go away when we are sideless, it simply trades places with our shifting mind, thus continuing to elude our grasp, like the absentia it represents. Yet another expression of Mobius-like forces upon our perception of the universe, as trading sides with a sideless world, is seen as isomorphically equivalent to untwisting a Mobius band, only to find that we have now twisted what was untwisted. We cannot escape the universe, or the paradox of the absentia. And the idea of transcendence through the absentia ensures that, wherever we go, there we are. But, the real beef I have with this idea of a sideless approach is how it attempts to eliminate or resolve paradox. As we have already pointed out, way back at the beginning of all this, paradoxes, especially predictable ones used to begin a universe, are a very necessary part of the structure of our universe, when viewed through the stages of our model. A single paradox offers the only possible origin to any universe, and therefore should not be resolved, for to do so would catastrophically eliminate that universe. The path from our original paradox to the relative definition of the mass is a gradient spectrum, part of the emergence and deliquescence of manifestation. I believe paradox holds an important place on that path, along with chaos and order, and should not be changed or defeated. Oddly enough, the paradox is one of our most valuable spiritual possessions, while uniformity of meaning is a sign of weakness. Hence, a religion becomes inwardly impoverished when it loses or waters down its paradoxes, but their multiplication enriches because only the paradox comes anywhere near to comprehending the fullness of life. Carl Jung. People with a love of science and a dislike of religion might balk at any mention of God or a possible God-force being seen in the patterns of nature. For the most part, I am one of those people. But, I know that other people like to ponder the so-called spiritual aspects of things, so I look that way too. The spiritual tone that comes from examining universal patterns seems evident. So where science and logical thought bring out patterns to see, wonderment of how and why they are what they are is worth exploring. So, after dealing with paradox for some time, I began to notice how one of the more interesting things that could be said about paradox, and the logic of paradox, is how it can be applied to life itself. One might even say that the problems the Mobius idea causes for a finite world seem to make an answer to the question of life as insurmountable as any other paradox. For example, given what we have theorized about the origin and destiny of our universe, as seen through the stages of our model, the meaning of life seems quite pointless. We pass through an apparent progression of ascending steps only to exit where we entered via our two impossibly connected points of absentia. Because of this, the action of broken symmetry becomes a futile existence, while at the same time, the balance of a perfectly symmetrical life creates stagnation. Because of this, we see how the eternity of nothingness remains as pointless as the transient expression of any model. And, because of conditions like endless ascent through recursive repetitions and relativistic scaling, we can see how the point at which another entity takes over becomes as original a beginning as the previous, in spite of what one gains from the other. We are forever stepping up and not going anywhere. So where do we belong? The endless ascent, from point to sphere, makes the development and growth of the model seem meaningless, while, to some, the reality that lies between begins to feel like a trap or finite prison of 3 dimensions, with the effects of diminishing returns isolating us all from each other, our Creator, and our perceptions of purpose. Think about the differences between the finite and the infinite, or the body and the spirit. On the one hand, the conditions we have theorized concerning the evolution of finite manifestation make it a complex and sometimes violent experience. Implosions and explosions, compression and radiance, human bodies, as well as human spirits, are fragile entities. They often succumb to illness and injuries, sometimes making the very act of maintaining a manifest form, or conscious mind, a burden. But, on the other hand, one has to admit that the privilege of being given a manifest form, and the miracle of birth from a stagnant world of nothingness, is unequaled in the universe. The exhilaration of form, energy, and senses is overwhelming. And the uniqueness of every individual creates a tapestry of creation and universal expression that is truly sacred. Every day a body lives is a day of unbelievable brutality, but oh, to have such senses. How can life be so rotten and so incredible at the same time? As I pondered this question, I asked myself, how can anything be anything and something else at the same time? Then I thought, perhaps the logic of paradox can offer some answers to this perplexing dilemma. When we apply the essence of paradox to the question of life, we realize the true nature of life itself, namely that life is a trap when we try to explain it and an opportunity when we don't. In other words, when we have the capabilities to understand life, we don't. And, when we lose the capability to understand, the meaning of life becomes all too obvious. In other words, by being simultaneously a trap and an opportunity, life is shown to be governed by the ultimate symmetry of our 2 points of absentia. Finally, in the spirit of true pretzel logic, we can now safely say that to know there is no meaning to life is to know the meaning of life. However, to be more precise, we should say that the meaning of life is in fact hidden within the realm of paradox and the Mobius twist that creates our 2 points of absentia. Thus, if the meaning of life is locked within the paradox of the absentia, some might be led to conclude that the existence of any supreme being, as in a god, must also exist within the realm of the 2 points of absentia and the Mobius twist. This then becomes the foundation for any pursuit of God or religion within the confines of our homemade universe. In looking for spiritual connections in all this, it's not difficult for me to conclude that because we all share the same outer absentia, God is in fact all around us, and, because all unobtainable centers will transcend to an equal state of impossible singularity, God must also exist within each and every one of us simultaneously. Not exactly a new idea, but our purpose then, from the point of view of our model, is to be a transient expression of universal flux and patterns in nature, and unite this split God with an endless augmentation of form. A mechanical purpose with a hidden meaning. By carrying this spiritual meaning one step further, one may also choose to view the outer absentia as a theoretical heaven and God and the inner absentia as a hell or devil within us, in which case our manifest forms would become an arena of conflict that connects, or separates, these two forces, thus providing us with a possible explanation for a universe that is both rotten on one hand and incredible on the other. In addition, we could also consider the Christian notion of God casting Satan out of heaven and into the depths of hell as a parable for the idea of imploding coagulation from God on the infinite outside to Satan on the finite inside. Revelation 12 verse 9. Our final purpose then would be one of perpetual reconciliation of divine opposites along this absentia to absentia spectrum of intermediary opposites. I have more to say about religion if you want to read my book. If you can find a spiritual tone within this study, that would be fine with me. If you see scientific patterns within this study, that would be fine as well. I am an advocate of both approaches, as long as one does not exclude one for the other. Scientists, looking for a unified theory of everything, have proposed an idea that involves the subatomic vibration of strings. Strings? Why not a Mobius band? We have shown how the center of our model equates, in isomorphic form, to the twist of a Mobius band. We have shown how the infinite in-between of our number line alternates and oscillates between sides at speeds relative to the tangible entity that each number line attempts to describe. Implosion and explosion, apart, together, our model vibrates like the macrocosm and microcosm it attempts to describe. As a string, or a Mobius band, or a Mobius sphere, or a simple number line, paradox remains a godforce to these abstract notions, thus uniting the spiritual with the scientific in an elegant symmetry of form. Models of spirituality that talk about transcending opposites to be united with the one usually talk about the unobtainable and ineffable nature of that one. If you choose to seek spirituality within the models and patterns offered in this study, it is my hope that it should be apparent by now that from the perspective of our model and non-model, paradox is the one. Not infinity. Not nothingness. Paradox. Paradox is God. Paradox is the ineffable source of all, the Tao of Te. From the perspective of this invented tarot universe, paradox is the irreducible crux of universal flux. Two paradoxical points of absentia, inner and outer, equal singularity and thereby unite a universe of opposites. A universe of opposites, nothing and everything, equals duality and thereby divides the 2 points of absentia. The one-sided effect of paradox cannot happen without the two sides that make it. And vice versa. That is the ultimate symmetry of a God. Look for this symmetry. Look for the twist. The symmetry is true. The twist is divine. Okay, that's enough for now. Did you get the idea that I, like Jung, like paradox? Give it some thought. In the meantime, thanks for watching. Hope it all made sense. Links to eBooks, decks and merchandise below. And, if anyone is interested in drawing a deck based on this system of organization and perplexing spirituality, don't hesitate to contact me for a collaboration.